welcome everybody, and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are actually joining us from. My name is Cindy Nicholson. I'm the CEO of Braintree. We're a global business advisory and leadership coaching company, and I'm based here in Sydney, Australia. I'd like to thank you all for taking the time out of your busy day to join us here for what's going to be an incredible and insightful, energetic conversation. Now, we're delighted, as I said, we've got over 60 people joining us today, so we encourage you to ask lots of questions by dropping them in the chat box, and we're going to be monitoring that, so we'll do our best to answer all of your questions. Now, you're in for a real treat today, and it brings me great joy to introduce our team. First, we have Andrew Buay. Andrew, do you want to give us a wave amongst all the sea of people there? Andrew joins us from Singtel Optus, where he's enjoyed over 30 years with Singtel as an ICT executive. He wears many hats across sustainability, social impact, and he's mentored and coached over 100 female leaders within the organisation. I have to say that also included me, Andrew. So thank you for that. As an advocate for gender equality, he believes that this journey has to be with a partnership in male companions and female companions across all genders. So that's how we're going to implement change, and we're really looking forward to hearing from Andrew and what he has to say there. And we also have the amazing Jodie Hampshire. Jodie, want to give us a wave? Jodie is the CEO of Russell Investments across Asia Pacific. She's currently also co-chair of the FSC's Funds Management Board Committee Diversity Working Group. Jodie's incredibly passionate about promoting women in leadership as well as wholehearted leadership. So much so that a little fun fact about Jodie is that in 2017, she led a collaboration of 4 adoptive parents to write and publish Lionheart, the real-life guide for adoptive families. And all proceeds from that book go to the projects supporting girls' education in Sierra Leone. And it's wonderful to have you both here. And I just want to say how much we really appreciate the time that you're taking to share your insights with everybody today. I'm also delighted to welcome Dr. James Zois, who will be co-hosting this panel today. And speaking of books, James has just launched his book last night. It's called Making It Count, 7 Steps to a More Meaningful Existence. So be sure to go to Amazon and check that out. James is a researcher and lecturer in human performance and as an international speaker. He's also an executive coach trying to create more meaningful people in leadership roles and their teams. So at Braintree, we're really active when it comes to supporting gender equality. And when James and I were talking about creating this panel discussion, we wanted to focus in on a specific area that we feel is a hidden gem to achieving gender equality. And that's how collaboration between the genders can create optimal leadership models for generations to come, breaking down those gender barriers in organisations and increasing productivity exponentially. And that's what our speakers are going to be here today to help give some guidance on. So with that backdrop, you don't need to hear any more from me. It's my pleasure to hand over to James to start off the conversation. So James, over to you.
Thank you, Cindy. That's a mouthful of an intro, and because we've got such amazing people on the panel, so it's great. Thank you for sharing your time with us, Andrew and Jodie, and everyone for sharing their lunch break with us. It's great to have you with us today. Like Cindy was mentioning there, one of the premises for this discussion was really when I put my human performance hat on and I look deeply into the opportunities that we have. You know, that gender equality issue is an obvious one that I feel we can make some real inroads. And so we want to talk about today, what is it that we can learn from each other and how can we help springboard, whether it's males or females, into leadership roles that help them in their careers, but also have a meaningful impact on the people that they lead. So I want to start off with Andrew. First question for you. As a male leader across a multicultural organisation, what are some of the observations of the strengths that different genders have, and how can we learn from them?
Well, thank you, James, and thanks everyone for having me here this afternoon, and also for the many familiar names I'm seeing. Thank you for the moral support. Just very quickly want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we're all present from today, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and future. So I suppose the way I look at it, the question, James, is, recently there's been, the last couple of years, a lot of literature on what are the new forms of leadership that is needed in a world that's volatile, you know, here VUCA, right? Volatile, uncertain, there's a lot of complexities and ambiguity. And also, what's the leadership model that's needed to deal with an upcoming generation of workers who have very different expectation of leaders? And when you hear words of leadership that is vulnerable, leadership that's purpose-driven, leadership that's nurturing, leadership that's inclusive, and I think of those qualities, actually, there are many of the qualities that women are very inclined towards in their leadership style. So therein, I say, starts with some of the strengths. And I'll say in the last 2 decades of my own leadership journey, I've always been quite mindful of some of these leadership qualities. And in fact, funnily enough, I've had sometimes both male and female colleagues, ones that I coach and work with, sometimes say, Andrew, you actually have a leadership style that is more like a woman. And I say, thank you. That's a great compliment.
Yeah, I mean, we should note that our discussion is in general terms. So there obviously are a lot of males and females that display a lot of these different attributes. That's without absolutely certain. However, what are some of the attributes there that you've noted? Vulnerability and nurturing. How do we explore these further? How can we, as males or females, how can we learn from them, and what can we do in our organizations to try and, I guess, create that optimal leadership and holistic understanding of leadership model that will springboard us into the future in a great way?
Well, exactly, those are examples of attributes, even in my own consciousness. You know, I've grown up and rose to the ranks in a very traditional leadership model where in the past it can be quite hierarchical, it can be quite directive. You know, the expectation of leaders is to have all the answers. And almost by default, because I've had to take on very diverse roles and lead in very diverse organizations that didn't come from areas that were my core competency, I've actually had to adapt my leadership style to that, right? So when you talk about going to a new area that you're not the expert, inclusive leadership, vulnerable leadership, the ability to just be able to draw knowledge from the diversity in the teams, as opposed to rely on yourself or rely on your seniority, because those models don't work when you're in totally greenfield areas that you're not competent for.
Yeah.
And even in my recent career, I think of it, you know, as I moved into a later stage of my journey, taking roles and leadership position that's a lot more purpose-driven, both personal purpose and linking it to corporates. And when I think of a lot of the role models of leaders who are purpose-driven, there's a very good reason why many of the women, the leaders of non-profit organizations or purpose-driven organizations, whether at the board level or at the CEO level, are actually women. So purpose-driven leadership is actually one attribute that I picked up from women, inspiring women that I worked with.
Yeah, so knowing your purpose and knowing how you can shape and impact an organization is obviously something that's critical, and you've picked up from female role models, which is fantastic. I'd like to quickly just go to Jodie. You've had an amazing career so far, and I'm sure moving into the future, you're going to be kicking a lot more goals. You've worked across 3 different countries, and so and you work in an environment, and I'm making a generalization here, I'm assuming is male dominated for most part. So I'd love to know a little bit more about, you know, your journey, and what are some of the strengths that you've had to tap into, potentially explore further, or were there some weaknesses that you thought, I've really got to, you know, explore opportunities to strengthen in this area because of the space that I'm working in?
Thank you. Thank you, James. So I come to you today from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to First Nations people, and excitedly look forward to voting yes in the referendum later this year. Andrew, I love that you said thank you when someone said you lead like a woman. What better compliment? So I'm going to focus on strengths, James, rather than weaknesses, if that's okay. 3 things I wanted to talk about. Preparing for this chat today, I really reflected on what I think I bring to the table as a leader, and of those things, which do we find in higher dosages in women versus men in general? And I came up with 3. The first one is courage. For most female leaders my age, the courage to just be here to start with, to put yourself forward, push yourself, to operate in really male-dominated spaces, as you've said, James, and the courage to operate with authenticity and not trying to turn yourself into a replica of a man. The other area I think courage is worth calling out, and the women online will absolutely agree with this. Female leaders are courageous because of all the other things that go with being a woman. Birthing children, mentally and physically struggling after having babies. Maybe you've got endometriosis, going through menopause. Personally, I had breast cancer within a few months of starting at Russell, which is, of course, mostly a female issue. And now being in chemical menopause because of the breast cancer treatment, some days I'm courageous just to not shout at people or to sit here in clothes like this and deal with the hot flushes that I have. So being a woman is a lot. Being a woman at work, leading people, that's a real lot. And I think that takes a certain sort of courage. The second thing, and it's one I speak about a lot, James, is wholeheartedness. And this was forced on me. When I had breast cancer, I had a double mastectomy, I lost all my hair. I had really no choice but to be quite open about stuff that was going on outside of my work life. But I've never looked back. It's been an approach I've continued with since then. So being wholehearted and turning up as your whole self to work is sort of half of the equation. The other half, as a leader, is genuinely caring and being interested about all of the people in your team and making sure that they know it, they know that. I think it's, anyone can figure out a spreadsheet, but not everyone can build deep, authentic relationships of trust from a team that choose to follow you. And I think wholehearted helps enormously with that. And the final one, which probably I should have reordered these because I've just bigged myself up, and my last point is humility. So it's not absolutely universal, but on average, I do observe female leaders are often less ego-driven than men. So much happier to say, I don't really know, let's talk about this. What do you think about this? What do you think about that? More happy to be wrong. And I think that leads to trust and improved leadership outcomes as well.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for sharing some of those quite personal and deep stories as well, Jodie. That's really good. In terms of, if you think back, and this, I guess this question is for either whoever wants to jump in and answer it. So when you think back to your starting days in your careers, what would be some of the skills or attributes that you wish that you knew a bit more about, or that you could you had time to develop perhaps a little bit further to better prepare you for the challenges that you guys are facing now and into the future?
I'm happy to start, Andrew.
Yes.
So I think probably earlier in my career, I was more of a young woman trying to come across with more male attributes and being, uber professional, uber serious. If I was going to present to a client, I made sure that I knew all of the things inside and out and over prepared. And I got to some point in my career where I realized that I was assumed by the people around me to be competent, and I didn't need to focus so much on that anymore, but I was missing a trick by not being myself at work. So this beautiful freedom in being able to be yourself at work, bring a bit of your personality to work. And that was sort of sowing the seeds for what I now describe as wholehearted leadership, very open, very transparent leadership. I think that has absolutely been a journey for me.
That's great. Andrew, we actually spoke about this, I think, a while ago when we mentioned that a lot of aspiring female leaders will sometimes hesitate to take on that leadership role or move beyond what their potential capabilities are, and there's a reason for that, I'm sure. But can you elaborate on your experiences in that, and potentially offer the audience today some avenues for courage building? What can they do to take that next step?
Yeah, thanks, James. And I suppose related to the question, maybe I'll just offer 2 points here. One, as I look back with the benefit of hindsight, I think the biggest insight is that given time, you can learn anything, right? So if I take that insight and every time you face off with a new role that you don't tick all the boxes, you could either think, I lack the courage. I don't tick the boxes. I've got this imposter syndrome and things like that. But I think you've got to give yourself credit that you can really learn. You will learn given the time. And sometimes you just have to immerse. And I think there was a juncture in my career that I was quite prepared to start taking on more radically different roles because I knew I had the ability to learn. But of course, when you're early in your career, you don't know that. So that's one dimension. I think the other second dimension is starting to think a lot more about my competencies and capabilities on a more holistic basis and finding how that diversity of my competencies can actually be value add even to areas that I'm not the expertise in. All right. So that was again a hindsight that over time you find your uniqueness and your value add. And that's the one that actually gives you the confidence. So for example, I think about 13 years ago when I was asked to be the CIO, and I'm actually an arts grad for that matter, to take over the Optus IT organization. Bindu is there and some of them are from IT. I remember standing up in front of my leaders at the kickoff and I was saying, look, I've got good news and bad news. Bad news is I'm actually an arts grad and I'm your CIO. I don't come from an IT background. And everyone could see literally their shoulders drop in despair, right? Arts grad leading IT. But I said, I've got good news. I am not from IT. I can learn from you. You can teach me. You can mentor me. And perhaps I'll bring a different value add. I know the business. Maybe it's some influential skills or thinking strategically, or bringing a customer lens to what is a technology organization. And that was how I led the IT organization. So I think the hindsight is with, you will learn. And number two, you have a unique value add. It's about focusing on that unique value add and not necessarily obsessing or writing yourself off because you haven't got certain skill sets and capabilities. And that's why diversity in teams is so important. And it's the diversity that actually enriches all your knowledge. If you know as a leader how to draw on that, even if you are not competent in every area.
Yeah, great. And I love how you've brought it back to teams because that's what I'm really passionate and focused on in my research and my career at the moment. So if we did that and we just thought about the optimal team that we can create, and there are obviously some clear gender differences in general terms speaking between males and females. I'm really keen to find out, what does it look like? What does the ultimate team look like in terms of a team that is working together to try and get the best out of each other? So what does that dynamic look like? How can we implement something like that with a focus and a lens of learning from the gender differences?
I'll take a stab at it, and Andrew might like to add. I think, I don't have a view on, this proportion, that proportion. I do have a view on, I think a highly functioning team is one where there is general agreement that a diverse team is an opportunity to increase the size of the pie, rather than what I think can happen sometimes where perhaps the men in a firm feel put offside by the focus on gender equity because they think they might be getting less of the pie. So it is absolutely evidence-based that female leaders increase the size of the pie, improve outcomes for organisations in general. So leaders need to be really clear that they see enormous benefit in diversity of approach, that they're committed to that, and then make sure that they're following that up with policies that allow equity amongst their workforce. Things like paternity leave, a workplace culture that celebrates female leaders, that delights in men being equal partners at home rather than pretending they're sort of Mad Men era work robots. That to me is the base of a really well functioning team. But you may have slightly different angle, Andrew.
No, I think Jodie, I agree with all of that. Maybe just to build on that, again, the ideal team it really depends on the nature of the context sometimes of the organization, the challenges you're dealing with. And I've been in startup type organizations or put into organizations that are underperforming, you need to turn around, or I've been put into organizations that you are starting up things new from scratch. So the nature of how the team varies quite significantly. But I go back to my earlier point, the diversity in the team is always very important. I found that the times that I had obvious diversity, diversity in knowledge, styles even, made a lot of difference. The times I was less than successful as a leader when I initially inherited a team that was quite homogeneous. And I remember one part of the organization that I took on, which was having problems. And initially it was a very homogeneous, very male-dominated environment. And I could see why we were unsuccessful, because some of the best ideas were just not being heard. It was always overspoken by a very outspoken individual within the organization. So diversity, but I think, values of just mutual respect for speaking up, which for Optus is a very important behavioral trait we're trying to promote. Everyone speaks up, get listened to, listen to learn. And then, sometimes as a leader, you still need to make a judgment call after having heard everything, but at least you're able to take the representation of the different views. Yeah. And I think, again, because we're dealing with a lot of new challenges that are quite volatile and unknown, right? There's a lot of areas, like, for example, I was leading HR, not as HR profession during the whole COVID. And, you're dealing with issues that have no playbooks. Nothing was written about it.
Yeah.
And in the example, I remember we were successful because the most diverse team, people from risk and facilities and property and cleaning and HR and all that. And I think it was a diversity of views. Everyone was very clear what was the objective, what would success look like, and everyone could contribute to that process. Everyone could be heard. And I think that made for success.
That's great. So can I go, you mentioned about when you first came into a particular team, and it was quite male-driven and quite difficult to get really good input from other leaders as well. What was the one thing that, if I was a fly on the wall, what was the one thing that was happening in your office and the one change that you wanted to make straight away in order to turn that around? How did you practically do that?
Well, that was, it went back to 2000 when I took over A-Link, part of the business, our internet and broadband business. I was losing quite a bit of money, right? Yeah. A lot of customer service issues, just a bit of context. And it was all males in the leadership team. But even within the males of the leadership, there were a couple of very dominant individuals. Like I mentioned, the sales director was a very outspoken individual, spoke the best, spoke the loudest. But we were not listening to the customer service team. The rep, even though it was a male, was quite a soft-spoken person, not so used to conflict. And I think it's just really getting the voices, giving others the equal opportunity to be heard, that I think started to make difference, because then the organization and the leadership team, we are listening to the right issues rather than just listening to who spoke the loudest, who spoke the most, And I would say later on in life, because I'm quite an introverted individual myself. And I remember when I first joined Optus, coming from an Asian organization, Asian culture, that's a bit like, you spoke when you're asked to speak, right? I remember I was having difficulty getting my voice heard at the Optus Exco. And I remember Paul Sullivan, who was our CEO then, was very deliberate in ways putting aside time to say, Andrew, can I hear your views? Sometimes giving me the last word, right? So it's, as a leader, when you give the individuals the chance to speak up, whoever they are, it's not a matter of gender or not.
Yeah.
As the voice gets heard and people start to appreciate, the dynamics actually changes quite significantly. And you, on one hand, build your confidence to let your voice heard, but there's also the space that's given to you to have your voice heard. And after a while, you get into that dynamic. Yeah,
no, that's fantastic. So I guess implementing that ability of hearing people's voices and having that openness was a real game changer for you and your team. And that's, again, as we mentioned at the beginning, potentially an attribute that is more, again, male and females both have these attributes, but potentially we see that a little bit more within the female domain. So I want to cross along to that space for a minute and tap into Jodie for a second here. We know the benefits of having females in our organizations, but like you said, the research is there. It's evident. CEOs, appointing female CEOs lead to almost 13% increase in the likelihood of outperforming in a variety of metrics, increasing revenue, and having just a holistic opinion and a better working environment. On that note, there are men as well in that space that understand those benefits and maybe feeling like they're a little bit left behind, or that in the discussion they're feeling like, well, what's our position? What do we do in this space? What else can we do to facilitate? What do you say to those males that understand the benefit and still want to try and contribute and foster growth in female participation in those senior leadership roles? What can they do to help in this situation?
I think some of the things that allied male leaders can do are be very open, publicly in your organisation about the benefits of diverse leadership. I think one of the things that society has historically done is labelled the specific skills that women tend to have, as I said, at higher dosages than men as soft skills. And I think just, killing that whole notion, right? The skills that, the particular skills that women bring to leadership are the opposite of soft, right? They're things that have a real impact on a business. Things, the things I spoke about earlier, courage, resilience, wholeheartedness, humility. Andrew mentioned vulnerability, listening to your customer. Like, they all sound warm and fuzzy, but like, they're not at all. These qualities build trust in a team, and I think females in general are excellent team builders. Trust in a team means that you get increased employee tenure and satisfaction. You get team members putting in discretionary effort rather than bare minimum. And a team that trusts each other and its leaders is okay to make mistakes, is okay to ask questions, is okay to really question the status quo. And I think that leads to innovation. So I think if leaders can be really clear about diversity increases the size of the pie for all of us, and we all have something to learn from each other. And then making sure that they're looking at the power structures in their organisation, looking at diversity in those, making sure, as Andrew's example was just then, making sure that the quieter people, which might be women, they might be men, but making sure they get a voice, because I can tell you they've got the really smart thing to say that you hadn't quite heard in all of the loud voices going on. So looking at power structures and having a commitment to diversity. And like, I have an example on this. As a female leader that's been accepted into places of power and influence, I see it as my responsibility to be a loud voice when it comes to gender equality. Because I'm a woman, yes. Because I'm a leader, yes. And because I have the ability to shoulder that burden right now, right? I've got good mental health. I'm white. I'm straight. Like, I've only got gender to shoulder the load on behalf of other women that might be dealing with other biases. So I made a rule a few years ago. I used to hear something and think, oh, that felt a bit sexist. And I'd go home and I'd think about it and I'd analyze it, and then you sort of miss your opportunity. I've made a rule in the last few years. If something feels sexist or racist or just out of what I want for the culture here, I have told myself I do not question it. I just say straight away, oh, that's a bit sexist. And I say it firmly and with a smile on my face. But I just think, as a leader, that is your responsibility, and that is what your team should expect from you, whether you're male or you're female.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of assisting young aspiring women coming through, and some of those skill sets or some of those intangible elements that we can learn from, and also young men. I mean, we're looking at creating amazing leaders, right? So for all of our organisations, what are some of the key things that you would say would be highlights that you would want them to be able to experience in their organisations to set them up for continued growth from a holistic perspective? Are there any type of experiences in particular that you could pinpoint and say that was an amazing experience that I had, and that really opened my eyes to a particular avenue that I needed to lead by example for?
Yeah, so I think sponsorship and mentorship is an extraordinarily powerful thing to have the opportunity to be part of. And my observation on this, a lot of women really want someone to mentor them or sponsor them. And when I say, have you asked anyone? They say, no. And I say, why? And I want to tell people on this call that senior females, senior males love nothing more, later in their career, to help people coming through. It's one of the greatest joys of my work life. Yeah. So, don't wait for your organisation to put in some all singing, all dancing sponsorship and mentorship structure if they've got it. And, we certainly do. And I know many firms do. But if there's nothing there for you, have a think about who you can reach out to and build relationships and learn from people that have been there and done the things that you're trying to do. I know when I mentor people or sponsor people, they ask me the same questions, right? The women in particular are going through the same things, and it's really awesome to be able to help them navigate some of it.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's some amazing feedback and comments there that I'm sure will help a lot of people in the audience. In terms of an organisational perspective, Andrew, we have some quite senior leaders on our call today, which we're very thankful for. What can they do? That some of them may be scratching their heads thinking, do we have, the structures in place that we're able to actually extract the best out of people? And do we have a process there by which we can learn from different experiences which are related from different genders' perspectives? What would be your take-home message or your input for those organisational leaders? What could they do to structure their organisation to take advantage of that?
Well, 2 layers. I think at one layer, before I get to the structure component, as leaders, if we can create a culture and environment of psychological safety, I think it's very important. Because in my experience, sometimes, when individuals, and again, could be females, could be males, lack the courage, lack the confidence, is probably because the organization or the leadership style or the culture doesn't create that psychological safety. Because what I found is, as a leader, if you can create that psychological safety, people feel comfortable to speak up, to learn, to make mistakes, and so forth. Actually, that psychological safety, even though it's a very soft, fuzzy term, makes a lot of difference for the confidence of people to push or take on harder roles or put their hands up and so forth. So I think that's one which is a bit more cultural and psychological. But yeah, in terms of structures, there's quite a lot of things that can be done. You could either have formal mentoring programs, coaching programs. In Optus, you're quite fortunate. Even though when I started 10 years ago, the reason why I started and went into coaching is because there was no structure. And I felt as a leader in the business, I couldn't just leave it to HR to set up a program. They didn't think it was the right time and it was too costly. But I felt we could do it. I could do it as a leader. I was passionate for it, went out, got my coaching accreditation. But today at Optus, we've got structures of mentoring network for women in leadership, women in technology. We've got structures around not only external, but internal coaches as well for our women leaders. So there are those sort of structures that you can actually put in place. What we are starting to do a lot better, I think, which is something I've always been passionate for, is actually more deliberate movement of our talent and women around into different roles. Because if we have a culture that encourages them to move, allows it to be done with a bit more planned basis behind that, and there's a culture of support for their success, I think over time you'll actually build women leadership that's a much broader breadth of experience and exposures to different leaders. And actually all these are preparing them for the next stage of their journey when they actually have to lead larger and wider organizations, right? So I do believe very passionately that one of the structures is actually moving women talent around more parts of the organization for them to build that breadth of knowledge.
Yeah, that's a great point. I love that idea of moving them around and getting an experience for different types of positions, and also they can then leave their own flair and their own input on those roles and start to create a more holistic, homogenous type of environment within the organisation, which is fantastic.
I'm loving, Andrew, how you're talking about that structure. And, one of the things you opened up with was about given time, you can learn anything. And, the positioning around structure and how people can move around, it really opens up that level of confidence for anyone to be able to embrace a new challenge and not feel that they might have an imposter syndrome that's relevant to their gender. Bindu is saying, yes, I asked the question, do you believe you have a voice in the workplace? And she said, yes, I do. I believe that I get heard, but organisations are huge and there are pockets and incidents where one may feel otherwise. Although it took a long time for me to realise, to feel safe to speak up. And by that time, I could see many of my male peers moved forward in their career. Interesting. Yeah. So back to your point, Andrew, being in the room with the chairman, who was able to give you that opportunity to be invited to speak up. that's the first point. And I think everybody learns from those leaders. So if you're a leader, you're setting the way, you're setting the examples of how others should behave. So if you're the chairman and you're willing to step up in a meeting and say, this person has a voice, this person has something to say and it's valuable, and I'm going to invite that person to do it, then others in that room are going to learn those behaviors as well. And I think that's really, really powerful. And going back to Bindu's point there, given that, you know, maybe she was a little bit more reserved at that point, then others have come forward who are more assertive. They've taken that position and they've taken the value of that. So, you know, how could Bindu have learned from others at that point in time to be a little bit more, perhaps a little bit more assertive? I'm not going to say aggressive, but a bit more assertive in that space.
I think, yeah. Oh, go ahead, please, Jodie.
Thank you. Cindy, I think it's very easy to be outspoken about gender issues when you're the leader of the organisation. It's a lot harder when you, and Bindu, I don't know about your role and how senior you are. Certainly earlier in my career, I would have found it really, really hard to speak up about stuff that I felt was a bit off. It's only as I've gotten more confident and more senior and older that I felt more confident. But my advice to people, you know, to younger women or younger minorities who see stuff and go, oh, that's a bit off, is to find the leadership person in your organization that is known for caring about these sorts of issues and have a chat with them, right? You don't need to carry all of this on your shoulders. You can go to someone and say, like, I'm seeing some sexist behavior. I'd love some advice on how to deal with it. And I guarantee you that that person that's very interested in diversity will be an ally to you and will take some of the load off your shoulders rather than all of it yourself.
Yeah. And thanks, Jodie. That was exactly what I wanted to say, because sometimes the issue we depend on, or women can depend on, is the immediate leader. And if, you know, sometimes you're not just happen to be in the right area with the right leader. And exactly to your point, it is finding that broader alliance of sorts so that you're not singularly dependent on an individual that could be a blocker. Right? If they are ones that supports you and so forth, great. But sometimes that dependency is the blocker. And exactly, it's similar when you have those situations. It's reaching out into the broader network, reaching out for guidance, because there would be people who would be prepared to back you in the alliance, speak up for you. And one of the things from a structure, if I think of that from a structure perspective, it's also organization structures that moves away from I call it single points of failure, single dependencies that decide on the fate and success of, say, a woman talent, right? And that's where when you have structures that it's a broader range of leaders that review the talent, talk about where they can go, where they can be moving to, who they can get sponsors or mentorship from, it becomes a collective responsibility as opposed to solely dependent on the leader. And I think that's one area, if I think to why we've had a lot more leaders in Singapore, women leaders move around, is you know, we have a career development council that's chaired by our CEO, and it has all the C-level leadership, and they review all the talent as a collective leadership team. So in that situation, you're not subject to the views, opinions, and perceptions of a single person, normally your leader, but to a broader audience, it tends to be a lot more objective in a sense. And today, again, when I think of what Kelly has done in the Optus environment, where there's a lot more collective discussion of the talent and the pool of talent, I think all these help in mobility and rotations and equity and so forth, versus a single point of dependency.
Andrew, it's great feedback, and you're getting quite a few comments here from females that you've mentored or led in the past, which speaks volumes for the type of work that you've done and how you've impacted on people as well in particular. A question for you, just to follow on from that. In terms of men, have you also worked quite a lot with different men in leadership roles, and what do you think are some of their gender-based challenges that you've experienced? And yeah,
I think the reality is, maybe it's a bit of context. When I started coaching 10 years ago, I used to just take anyone that came out from the talent program. It used to be a bit more male dominant because that was the mix in the Optus talent program. Then 3 years in, I started to be more conscious of the issue of this gender issue. I was quite blind to it, actually. And I just decided at the time to swing 100% to female leaders. But over the years, I have coached a mix. The reality is almost like what was mentioned earlier. If you really brought it down to individuals, you have males and females with exactly the same challenge.
Yeah.
Right? Sometimes the challenge comes from cultural attributes, not gender attributes. Right. So if we talk about generalizing that women has an issue of speaking up, confidence, etc., I can tell you for a lot of the Asian leaders I work with, speaking up is a challenge because culturally it may not be in their culture to be to speak up on their own unless maybe they're asked to speak up. Right. So I think it does come down to there are quite common, a lot of common areas, regardless of whether you're male and female. I think if I were to generalize, what are a couple of attributes? One is most individuals tend to think of leadership in a very traditional functional leadership mode. And if there's any one big lens I try and give them is when an organization looks at a leader, they're also looking for enterprise leadership. And that's the way to get visibility beyond your immediate management. Is there something at the enterprise level that you can be known for, you can lead, you can value add, you can shape? There's nothing to do with your functional area. So within the audience, we have some individuals who have taken on, as chair of the culture network for the organization, or Elevate, which is our women's network, right? So those are examples where they choose to champion something that's at the organizational level, that they can lead a diverse set of leaders that comes from all parts of the organization for a topic that's very important to the whole company.
Yeah,
I think that would be an example of raising the visibility, raising the profile, raising their confidence of leadership, and move it beyond a functional leadership, because a functional leadership tends to get stuck in the hierarchy. So those are examples you can actually think about, and it equally goes to both males and females as well.
Yeah, and for you, Jodie, that enterprise leadership piece must be quite important in Russell Investments and the work that you've done. How do you see that? How do you foster that in leaders underneath you that are coming through the ranks?
I think, as Andrew says, giving high potential team members the opportunity to stretch and to do something different. I think, typically when I have someone come to me that's a strong performer in their day job saying, like, what do I need, what do I need to progress and to do next? More often than not, I'll find them something to do that might be part of a global project where they're stepping outside of their day-to-day. They might have experiences and insights that are going to plug into that global project, but they're doing something a little bit different so that they're diversifying their skill set. They're learning how to work with colleagues around the globe. And I smiled as Andrew was describing some stereotypes about Asian associates. Like, I've gone through that in my move from running Australia to Asia Pacific. In the last couple of years. I've had to learn how to get my team members in Asia to tell me what they really think and to answer questions. Like, Australians are so brash and direct. I've had to adjust my style, and they've been teaching me, right? We have this great conversation where, my Korean leader told me about how they went to school, how he went to school, right? And you had to be the same as everybody else, and you didn't want to put your hand up and ask a question or answer a question. So, like, this has been wonderful learning. But yeah, putting people in situations where they're getting a different experience and learning some different skills and stretching beyond their day-to-day.
Yeah, that's great. And I guess a follow-on, this is a little bit left of center, but building on habits is a really important one. I feel from just in any kind of performance perspective that you look at. What are some of the key attributes that you look for in terms of trying to build on successful habits? How do you try to keep on building the successful habits and removing some of the old habits that are potentially not helpful in developing yourself or coming through as a leader? Is there anything that you can put your finger on that has worked really well for you, perhaps?
Yeah. So for me, I am very deliberate about thinking about what my job is, because my job could be all sorts of things. But I distill it down to like 3 or 4 things. And at the start of the year, list out, this is my job. and I'll reflect every quarter or so on whether I'm actually doing the things that I think are my job. So I'm very disciplined and very careful to make sure that I'm delivering to people what I think I should be delivering for them. What else in terms of habit creation? There's a lot of things in my career that, like, the sayings that the team around me know that I'm going to say to them because I've said it so much, like feedback is a gift. And if I present to a client with a colleague, I'll always try and give them some feedback. You did this great, work on this for next time. I work with the women in particular when they're presenting to not say I just have a question, I just want this. So like there's all these tiny little tips that you give people through your career that you hope leave an impression and leave a mark with them and create better outcomes for them in their careers.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And Andrew, I noticed you were smiling quite a lot through that. So I'm thinking that you potentially have some interesting habits that you'd love to share with the audience.
Bad habits or good habits?
I'm actually going to preface that by saying I'm going to ask the audience after I get my opinion on this.
You can get them to vote what are my bad habits. Many of them, we were quite honest. No, the reason why I was screening when Jodie was sharing experience, and she was talking about being very clear about what her job is, right? I was wanting to add that, yeah, on the one hand, you got to be very clear what your job is. But one habit, I don't know whether it's a good or bad habit, but I always think about what is not in my job that I still want to do and stand for.
Yeah.
And in a funny sort of way, that thinking has led me down very different career paths in many jobs I now hold and have held. Everything from my internal coaching to sustainability was because while I had my day job, I also had some passions that I was prepared to focus on and be known for. And in a funny sort of way, subsequently, they shaped themselves into jobs that were given to me. Sustainability didn't exist, but when I was leading the product group and IT, we used to do a lot of social impact volunteering, right? So at least by the time I put my head up and say, hey, I think there's a need for the company to drive sustainability, I had a track record and people knew me for being able to do it, even though it was not my day job. Coaching was the same thing, right? I was known to always be prepared to be very people-oriented, spend time, mentor people. So when I put up my hand and say, I actually think there's a role to play as an internal coach, there was believability. And when I was asked to cover HR right through the whole COVID, I'm not an HR person, but I suppose the leadership felt, hey, that person is a very people-oriented person.
Yeah.
And maybe, you probably know something about HR. So I think there's your day job, and they say nowadays you got to have a side gig.
Yeah.
And sometimes that side gig, the side hustle, right?
Yeah.
So that's why I was sort of chuckling when Jodie mentioned you got to be clear on your job. You have to be that so that you can deliver to what's expected of you. And then if you've done that, what else can you do that demonstrates you've got a lot more potential and other areas that you can contribute? But obviously, there must be contributions to areas that are important and the organization can benefit from, not necessarily your own side gig that has nothing to do with the success of the organization.
Yeah. No, I love how you're utilizing that side hustle as a way to continue to extend yourself. Because let's be honest, not everyone is in a job where they can explore themselves in a way that is meaningful and valuable to them. So using that side hustle in a way where they can look at challenging themselves in a different perspective, then potentially leads to the position they really want to be in, or opens up doors that they didn't know existed to begin with. So I want to open up another door then, as we almost come to the conclusion of this, and I want to open up a door to the audience to be able to ask a question of Andrew and Jodie. We've got such amazing people here sharing their time with us, which is just incredible. Any questions that you'd like to ask Andrew and Jodie? They're not very scary, trust me. They're pretty open people. And so, yeah, go for it, Danielle.
Yeah, I do. And I mean, it was, Andrew, thank you. You went on to focus more on attributes. And I was going to ask a question earlier, because where do we see ourselves in 10 to 15 years' time from a leadership perspective with gender, when we're seeing that you know, people aren't identifying as a gender, or they change the way they identify. You're seeing mixed family units, nature versus nurture in male versus females. How do you see that progressing with respect to, I suppose, society, but the workplace with respect to attributes and how we behave?
That's a fantastic question, Danielle. Thanks for asking that. A difficult one, though. The way I look at it is, initially, when you're trying to drive better equity, sometimes you need to be a bit more focused, right? Is it in gender? Is it in disability? Is it in age and so forth? And I think, my belief, in fact, I believe that to drive that equity, it is all about universal values. And even though we today are directing that conversation into gender, the takeaway should not be about gender equity. The takeaway is actually we're engendering, or not the right word, we are encouraging a universal set of behaviors, value systems, structures, etc., that actually will benefit every dimension of diversity. So that in future, I hope when we talk about the diversity, we don't need to be talking about, is it gender, is it sexuality, is it disabilities and so forth, because then the company embraces the practice, the value systems, the attitudes that supports all that diversity. And I think when that day arrives, we have arrived. I don't know when that will be, but I think we'll arrive. And that should be, I think, our ultimate aim.
Yeah, that's great. Very good. Any other questions for Jodie and Andrew from the audience?
Yeah, just a
Alan?
what I've been happy about is that it's not one side or another. It's quite often in arguments that go on that there's people saying, oh, I want the women in payments or biodiversity one side or another. It should be like it's been, everyone equally discussing, so we're all wind up in equal position. It's not, because what I find is otherwise people can be very conservative, who get upset if someone's pushing in their face, oh, I want women's in payments. No, we should be considering that we're all equal and we've all got different attributes. And that's one of the things that was raised very early on. We've got different attributes, different abilities, and it should be working together. So we are looking at, and unfortunately, you know, in my working life, I've seen it's the wrong phrase, but I still say a lot of the payments industry is still male chauvinist white Australia. And it's some of that thinking, but some cases it's been caused because the people who've got a position of change, it's been put in their face. I know, I want change. We're not talking together and agreeing what is, where both sides are coming from, and people work together.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very good comment, Alan. Very good comment. Yeah, we try to take a lens of what can we learn from each other, regardless of your gender. What can we learn so that we can create better leaders and better outcomes for people, better work environment, better life scenarios, and better teams. And that's the main premise of this discussion. I'd like to quickly probably wrap it up very soon, but Andrew and Jodie, maybe a couple of take-home messages that, you know, if people were busy having lunch and weren't listening, what would be the absolute key take-homes that they should be paying attention to?
Okay, I'm happy to start. So take-home message number one is more female leaders improves organisations and increases the size of the pie. So kill this notion of it being nice or woke. It makes people money. Soft skills are the opposite of soft, in my view. Secondly, and this links back to Alan's comment just then, wholehearted leaders that want to hear from everyone that's in the team and to treat people respectfully, make the workplace safe for teams to bring their whole selves to work. That creates trust in teams and that benefits business. And then my third takeaway would be, if you're in a leadership role, whoever you are, it's your responsibility to call out biased behaviour and make sure that you don't, make it really clear that you don't accept it.
Yeah, great. Andrew?
Well, for me, the three takeaways I'd like to leave people with is, you know, for individuals, understand how holistic your competencies are, because when you know and understand your competencies and where you can transfer them to and port them to, that gives you a lens of agility. I'll say the second one is for those skills you don't have, don't go into the imposter syndrome. Learning curve is a normal thing. And, find allyship in that learning curve, find complementarity of people who know if you don't. And that's why courage to reach out and connect with mentors, as Jodie mentioned, is very important. And I'll say the third one, which is what I mentioned earlier, think like an enterprise leader. Don't think like a functional leader, because when you think at an enterprise level, you tend to find a position, you tend to find an agenda that you can be standing for and known, as opposed to a functional leader is what we expect of you as a leader in that role. That's your job description.
Yeah, that second point really resonates really well with me in terms of, growing up as a semi-professional athlete. Was our number one focus was always surround yourself by people that are better than you in certain ways and learn from them. Doesn't matter who they are, doesn't matter what gender, what age, doesn't matter. If they're better than you at something, find them, source them out, get around them and learn whatever you can from them, so you can become equally as good as them one day, hopefully, and have your own perspectives from that. Fantastic. Look, I've loved having you guys. Thank you so much for being involved, Andrew and Jodie, and everybody in the audience. Cindy, would you like to wrap it up with a few key messages?
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you so much, James. You've done an amazing job and really inspired the conversation. Thank you so much, and for Jodie and Andrew for being so open and vulnerable with what they've shared as well. And I think, a couple of things I've taken away, obviously the three key points that Andrew and Jodie have just mentioned, but on a general basis, what I'm hearing is that we actually all have our own role to play in bringing together the strengths of our colleagues and to help us all grow and to create that sort of universal approach around, collaboration and connection. And that changes the way that we will operate as by default. So by removing that sort of, you're a male, you're a female, whatever your gender preference is, let's just get together and let's just collaborate and connect. And I think that also comes back down to culture. And that's a real key component to encouraging everyone to step up into that enterprise leadership that Andrew spoke about. And many of us have actually got passions that we come to work with. And in past times, we've never had the opportunity to express those passions. And nowadays, when you're an organization that has the opportunity to say, we have got ESG policies, we are proactive in CSR, we're proactive in diversity, equity and inclusion, people will be attracted to come and work at that organization because they can bring their own beliefs to the organization and then step up into that enterprise leadership, which I think is just amazing. So that was my sort of bit of a view on that. And before I wrap up, I just really want to sincerely thank you for giving up your time, for being with us today, for sharing openly, supporting each other, and for trusting in us to bring value to you today. And we really do appreciate that to put on an event like this takes a lot of time and effort from our presenters, from our facilitators. And I'd like to really thank all of you specifically for your time in and your support in bringing today's agenda together. Now, if you can please all just join me in thanking our guest panelists, Andrew and Jodie, and our amazing facilitator, James. And we all look forward to seeing you again in our future events, which are all very, very welcome to check out and enjoy. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.